Hi everyone and welcome to this video. In this video we'll discuss the persona. I'll try to give you an overview of what Carl Jung, psychoanalyst Carl Jung, understands as the persona in the context of the larger architecture of the psyche that he proposes. As you know, the channel is concerned mostly with videos on Carl Jung and psychology in general, but if you do have any other suggestions, any suggestions for videos you want to hear, anything you have always been curious about, either on Carl Jung or psychology, neuroscience, and psychoanalysis, or even philosophy perhaps in general, then please leave a comment below and I'll try to make a video on the topic if I have any sufficient knowledge about it and can relate it to the general aims of this channel. Also, do consider to subscribe if you like the format of this video, and of course leave a like to boost the algorithm. The persona is a very important component of the psyche, right? It is part of the ego, and as we'll go through the persona, we'll see that it plays a very important role in linking the subject, so that is us, to that which is sort of considered the larger context in which the subject exists. We'll briefly split this video into 4 sections. We'll talk about definitions of the persona. I'll give you some perspectives that Jung gives us, some quotes. We'll talk about the role of the persona. So what does the persona actually, why does it exist? And we'll talk about illustrations of the persona in dreams, so how the persona may appear in dreams. And then finally, we'll talk about the relationship between the persona and the ego and the sort of the threats of the persona. Starting off with a brief recap. So Carl Jung, was a psychoanalyst working at the turn of the 20th century. He was a student of Freud, and Freud being sort of considered the father of psychoanalysis in a way. Although he did not invent the unconscious is an idea that has been around for a very long time. Freud was the first to sort of systematize working with the unconscious in a sort of therapeutic method. And along with this method, of course, he proposed sort of a range of theories. And Jung, as a student, continued to work on those theories and diverted from Freud. They had a break over certain notions from that Jung didn't agree with on the side of Freud, and then Jung sort of continued developing certain concepts, especially the concept of the collective unconscious and the archetypes that Freud ended up not agreeing with. And so they sort of there was a break between them, and ever since then you can say that largely speaking the Freudian and Jungian schools are split up. The persona is so let's now move on to sort of attempting to define the persona. The persona is quite a specifically Jungian concept, right? It is the facade that we present to the world. The word persona is derived from the Latin word for mask and represents the role we play in societal interactions. The persona basically is determined by how others ought to see us, but in a very particular way. So you may have a general neurotic structure in a subject, according to sort of the Freudian Lacanian system, where we may argue that we always act in order to satisfy the desire or to arouse the desire of a certain other. But the persona goes a step further. It is a mask that you can change. So you conform to certain societal conventions in a given situation. So you may go to university or school or work and put on a certain mask, and then at home you put on a certain other mask, and the persona is essentially those masks that you have at your disposal, and they may be added to at will. The persona is loosely related to your ego, but I would say, and we'll talk about this later in a lot more detail, that the persona overrides the ego being that which you think you are, right? It's not who you are, but it's what you think you are. Jung says that the persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself as well as others think one is. That is Jung speaking. And so the problem here is, as you already see, a potential mix-up, a potential confusion about who am I and who am I acting to be in a given situation. And this is important because Jung says that the psyche or the subject as a whole is essentially threatened by two sides, if you will, two aspects of its action in reality. And that is, on the one hand, an overly strong identification with the persona, so with the masks, the roles that we play. This would be the let's say the president that is always addressed as sir, sir, blah blah blah, and then he comes home and wants his children to call him sir and his wife to call him sir as well. That is, of course, then an overly strong identification with this role, with this persona aspect of himself, right? It's the same goes with people that, if you see people that are exercising and they're doing some kind of workout, they picked up some kind of workout, and they're always walking around in their active wear. It's like, well, they're overly identified with precisely this role of being this fit person, right? And we see this happen often in times of social media, where people where people's identity on social media spills over to the identity in reality, right? Jung says in another place in his 2 essays on analytic psychology, says the persona is a kind of mask designed on the one hand to make a definite impression upon others, and on the other to conceal the true nature of the individual. So this true nature has two aspects, of course, as we know. There's the aspect of the self, so the true aspect that we ourselves don't really know about. And then there's the aspect of the ego, which is all these kinds of aspects of yourself that you want to hide, potentially. And the persona conceals, in the first instance, the ego, because the self is automatically concealed because it is already concealed by the ego, right? We don't know the self, we cannot interact with it directly, and so essentially what the persona does is it attempts to hide all those things that we don't want others to see, right? And to an extent, those things that we don't want ourselves to see either. Jung says, in yet another point in the archetypes in the collective unconscious, his collected works, he says the persona is a complicated system of relations between individual consciousness and society. Fitting, like, again, that's what we said, right? It's on the one hand complying to the demands of society, to that which society demands in a given situation. If you're in a restaurant, you behave in a certain way, and so on. On the other hand, it is also a compensatory almost reflection of concealing that which we don't want others to see. Fittingly enough, a kind of mask designed on the one hand to make a definite impression upon others, and on the other to conceal the true nature of the individual. Again, that's the same quote as or same ending as the quote up that I read earlier. However, Jung also says the construction of the persona is a necessary stage in the development of the individual, but the identification with the persona is always a source of conflict. That is, and this gets us to sort of the next section, which is the role of the persona, which is the persona is ultimately a protective and plays a protective role that is designated to help us communicate and adapt to certain social situations in order to build what we would call a social standing. And Jung doesn't necessarily say this is problematic. In fact, Jung splits his process of individuation. Remember, the process of individuation is the process by which the psyche naturally unfolds towards the self being sort of the true objective core of who you are, this axis, this connection to the collective unconscious. And the persona, however, and the development of the persona as an aspect of the ego is part of the first half of individuation. So Jung splits individuation into two components. On the one hand, you develop a strong ego, you differentiate the ego from the self that encompasses it in the first place, and then you build a relationship with the self via the self-ego axis or the ego-self axis. And so these three essential functions of the persona: social adaptation, being able to navigate a social situation, essentially, without, let's say, overly complying to it, but in terms of the persona, understanding what is expected of me and then acting accordingly. Protection, the persona protects us from, let's say, the confrontation of that which is within us with that which may not agree with it, and that that's what we will call sort of negative. I call that negative judgment. So when the ego encounters something in the sort of in the external that it has thought to be X, but it is actually Y, then the ego may be traumatized. And I made a video on the topic of trauma. You can find it on the channel, or maybe I'll add it in the description below. But basically, the persona protects us from precisely this possibly traumatic experience. And then finally, the ability to communicate with others, which simply arises from, let's say, the shared jargon that the persona affords us. Now, let's get to briefly get to the persona and its representations in dreams. Again, the persona is a kind of mask, and in dreams it often appears as a mask. It may appear as a sort of theater play. We may realize or step away from a sort of stage. We may also aspects of embarrassment sort of on a stage. That's a frequent dream theme. You're on a stage and you're embarrassed because you forgot a line, and that's sort of non-compliance or the sort of lack of this strong persona. There's a lot to say about this dream aspect here, and I'll make a separate video on dreams in general than on particular themes in dreams. But in general, anything to do with a stage or a theater or a sort of a mask, you can link to images of the persona. And finally, the relationship between the persona and the ego is a quite important one, because the ego, as I said on multiple occasions, is simply sort of a function, a reflexive function, a sort of narrative that is constructed on top of the percepts that we encounter as we move through the world. So if you see, let's say, a dog, for example, and you're narrating to yourself, oh, this dog is XYZ and it's so cute, it's so fluffy, it's so adorable, then perhaps this doesn't comply to the reality of the dog as a whole, because the dog also killed 2 kittens yesterday or whatever, and you don't account for that in your perspective of the dog, but it had still the reality of the dog. So you overwrite this reality, simplify it, and sort of to include it in a sort of linear narrative that you build yourself over time, right? The persona in this conglomerate is the relationship that you have to that which you are interacting with, that which we call society. The persona then acts as a protective layer to not have you to avoid the encounter with precisely the falsifying reality against the backdrop of that which the ego sort of narrated previously. So again, the persona is part of the ego, but it serves a different function. While the ego is our conscious awareness and personal identity, the persona is the face and the sort of the surface that we show to the world. So the ego includes a lot of aspects that are not necessarily, let's say, displayable, while the persona is precisely that which we consider to be displayable and shareable. And the persona is shaped accordingly, right? It's shaped, again, based on feedback loops. That's how the psyche develops in general, based on feedback loops, right? If we get positive feedback, we'll sort of strengthen a certain aspect, and if we get negative feedback, we'll weaken it. Finally, I want to say, sort of in the concluding, a couple of concluding words. So the persona, again, is not it's not something to get rid of. It's also not something to identify with, but it's not something that we do not want to, let's say, have, right? It's the same as the ego. People often say, well, oh, this is just you acting through your ego. Well, sure, it's good to be aware of those sort of micro actions, and I'll get into that in other videos, but you don't really want to get rid of them, because you can't get, well, first of all, you can't get rid of the ego, And the persona helps you through precisely that which I just said. You know, reality can be very painful, especially under the guise of the ego that you can't turn it off. You know, the ego is always there. It's always that which it is, which is, you know, this entity that structures reality by interpreting it. And the persona protects you from the negative judgment, which means it protects you essentially from trauma. And a well-adapted persona is, contrary to common belief, not as problematic as you may think, because it helps you to have a standing in the world. And that in the first instance is good, as long as you're aware that you shouldn't identify with it too much. And that's the balance we have to strike, right? We have to be able to see and clearly recognize and develop a certain awareness and a distance, I would call it distance, from that which we think we are in certain moments. If you're interested in this topic, then please leave a comment below, and I can make more in-depth videos also on sort of maybe how to disidentify or how to detach from the persona. And if you want to have videos on other topics, then please let me know as well. I'll be curious to interact with you, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. That'd be much appreciated. Thanks very much.